Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with a further update as to what's happening with regards to the proposed peace deal in Ukraine. Now, if you've been following the channel, you'll know that I recently posted a video talking about the meeting between Donald Trump and President Zelensky of Ukraine that took place in the White House last week. And if you haven't seen that video, please check it out because it's excruciatingly embarrassing.
You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. Right now, you don't. You're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III.
I'm following on from those toe-curling scenes, which reminded me of horrible family get-togethers where two old uncles decide to get into an argument and don't listen to what the other person is saying. They just keep talking louder and louder over each other. Lots of European leaders came out in support of President Zelensky of Ukraine. French President Emmanuel Macron posted a message saying, "There is an aggressor, Russia. There is a victim, Ukraine. We were right to help Ukraine and sanction Russia 3 years ago and to keep doing so." Germany's Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock said the unspeakable row resembled a bad dream and underlined that a new age of infamy has begun. She said she would wholeheartedly push for measures that could help Ukraine withstand Russia's aggression, even if the US withdraws support, so that it can achieve a just peace and not a capitulation. And interestingly, Friedrich Merz, who's likely to take over as the next Chancellor of Germany, said that the clash in the White House was not a spontaneous reaction to interventions by Zelensky, but obviously a manufactured escalation in this meeting in the Oval Office. Merz, who's seeking to form a coalition after his Conservatives won a snap election last month, said that Europe is now under pressure to act quickly. "We must now show that we are in a position to act independently in Europe," he said. Dutch Prime Minister Dick Schoof said the Netherlands supports Ukraine now more than ever, adding, "We want a lasting peace and an end to the war of aggression started by Russia." Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said Canada will continue to stand with Ukraine and Ukrainians in achieving a just and lasting peace. And European Union chiefs Antonio Costa and Ursula von der Leyen assured Zelensky in a joint statement that he was never alone. "We will continue working with you for a just and lasting peace," they said. Now, interestingly, lots of those quotes from European leaders referred to a peace agreement rather than winning the war and trying to stop Russia. They're talking about a peace settlement. And this is obviously something that Donald Trump has been promoting since he took over as the president of the US. He wants the war to stop. And this is a bone of contention, I think, from Ukraine's point of view. And one of the things that caused a flashpoint in the meeting at the White House was when President Zelensky was saying that a ceasefire simply wouldn't work, that he signed a ceasefire with President Putin back in 2019 relating to the invasion of Crimea. And as part of that deal, Ukraine allowed the gas to be able to be transmitted across Ukraine into Europe. However, he said that President Putin has subsequently breached that ceasefire agreement on 25 occasions, and obviously the invasion of Ukraine that started in 2022 represents the most serious breach of that ceasefire agreement. So what he was saying was that it doesn't really work to agree a ceasefire or some sort of peace deal with Russia because he doesn't trust them to be able to keep to that agreement going forward. And I think what's really interesting in terms of what's followed on from the meeting in the White House is that France have now put forward a proposal for a 1-month ceasefire in the war in Ukraine. Now, this proposed ceasefire isn't actually a ceasefire because obviously Russia would need to sign up to that, and it's unlikely that President Putin is going to agree a 1-month ceasefire without getting something in return. But what France is proposing is that for the next month, if Russia agrees to it, there won't be any air attacks, there won't be any sea attacks, and there won't be any attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure. And what France has said is that this would be a test to prove whether or not Russia could keep to the terms of a ceasefire. And the inference is that if Russia does keep to those terms, if it doesn't undertake any of those attacks for the month during which they agree to the ceasefire, then that proves that Russia is trustworthy and therefore indicates that Ukraine is now being moved along the road of agreeing some sort of peace deal. And following a meeting between the leaders of 18 countries, including the UK, France, Germany, Norway, Italy, Spain, Canada and Ukraine, but importantly not the USA. It was announced that a 4-point plan to work with Ukraine to end the war and defend the country from Russia had been agreed, and these 4 points were to keep military aid flowing into Ukraine and to keep increasing the economic pressure on Russia, that any lasting peace must ensure Ukraine's sovereignty and security, and Ukraine must be present at any peace talks, in the event of a peace deal to boost Ukraine's defence capabilities to defer any future invasion, and to develop a coalition of the willing to defend the deal in Ukraine and to guarantee peace afterwards. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think the meeting in the White House last week between President Zelensky and President Trump was an absolute disaster. That didn't go the way that Ukraine wanted it to in any shape or form. President Zelensky went over to the US to sign a minerals deal with the US because the USA needs to get access to more rare earth minerals and other compounds that it's currently importing from China because of the trade tension that's currently building between the US and China. However, that deal was not signed. It was on the table. It was ready to go. However, as you saw in the meeting, it fell apart because we got off track. J.D. Vance started saying to President Zelensky that he hadn't said thank you for anything that the USA had done. And then President Trump followed that up with a lot of other stuff, and it just degenerated into a slanging match. And then the deal was taken off the table and everybody went home. And obviously, that isn't very productive when you're talking about a war that's been going on for more than 3 years. Volodymyr Zelensky was hoping that signing the minerals deal would be the first step on the US and Ukraine getting closer during Donald Trump's presidency. However, it now looks like they've become further apart. And this throws a huge question mark over what's going to happen with regards to the war, because up until now, the narrative over the last few weeks has been that Donald Trump was going to agree some sort of peace deal. President Putin of Russia seemed receptive to that deal. There's been some discussion. They've had a telephone conversation, and there was certainly some murmurings coming out of the Kremlin that Russia may be receptive to stopping the war. However, all of that is now up in the air. But what we've seen in today's video is that the leaders of Europe have come out in support of Zelensky and Ukraine. However, they're now talking about a peace settlement. So it looks like everybody is now working towards some form of peace deal. And France has now proposed this 1-month truce, whereby Russia will agree not to do any airstrikes, any sea strikes, and not to hit any Ukrainian infrastructure. And the inference here is that France believes that if Russia holds off on all of that sort of activity for 1 month, then it proves that Russia will be true to its word and won't breach any ceasefire agreement if it's ultimately signed. Now, I don't know whether or not Ukraine will believe that, because as we heard from the meeting at the White House, President Zelensky has said that Russia has breached the previous ceasefire agreement on 25 occasions, not least the full-scale invasion of the 20% of Ukraine that it's now occupying. So I don't think Ukrainians will fully believe what Russia is going to sign. However, it looks like the leaders of Europe are now pulling in line with what the USA have been talking about for the last month, and that everybody is now working towards some sort of peace deal. And as we've discussed before, that peace deal will most likely involve giving Russia the 20% of Ukraine that it's currently occupying, because President Putin is very, very unlikely to withdraw from any of that land. So it looks like Ukraine may have to just lose 20% of its former territory to get a peace deal. And it'll be interesting to see what happens over the course of the next few weeks. The rest of the European nations haven't come out in support of France's proposal, so that isn't a formal deal that's been put forward to Ukraine at this point. However, it does look like everyone is moving in that direction. And the USA reportedly still wants to do that minerals deal. Ukraine have said that they are prepared to go through with that deal. They will sign it to give the USA access to those rare earth minerals. And that really will bring President Trump back round the table. And I think it'll be fascinating to see what happens over the course of the next few weeks, whether or not the US does re-engage with Russia and Ukraine and Europe, or if Donald Trump decides that this is the point that the US wants to pull back entirely from what's happening in Europe. He keeps mentioning that there's a large sea in between the two nations, so the USA is feeling quite relaxed in terms of the threat posed by Russia. And if that does happen, if the USA does pull back, then Europe will be left to work out some sort of peace deal. But it certainly looks like the wheels are in motion at the moment to get some sort of peace settlement on the table. And if that happens long term, that would probably be good for the global economy because it will bring an element of stability back. However, it's obviously bad news for Ukraine because they're going to lose 20% of their territory that's been invaded by Russia. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and thank you so much to everybody that's supporting the channel. If you've bought me a coffee, thank you for that. If you've sent me a YouTube super thanks, really appreciate it. And if you've signed up as a Patreon or a YouTube member, really, really appreciate that long-term support. Really does help to keep me motivated. And of course, you can watch my videos on both of those without having to watch any adverts or promotions. So thank you for everybody that's supporting the channel, and here's something to put a smile on your face.